Welcome to another episode of Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. This episode comes from a powerful conversation Adam had with Bob and Kelly Pascuzzi, whose story of forgiveness after unthinkable tragedy has touched thousands. In this deeply personal discussion, you'll learn the 6 words that can save any relationship, why your brain and your faith should work together, and how that's also the origin story of why Adam started Church of the Resurrection, why forgiveness might be the most important skill you'll ever learn, and so much more. This episode is both deeply moving and remarkably practical. Let's dive right in.
Bob and Kelly, it's great to be with both of you today. I so appreciate you and what you're doing.
Great. Thank you very much.
Adam, I think where Kelly and I would like to kind of start today is your origin story.
Sure.
It's so amazing to me. Obviously, this, Church of the Resurrection didn't happen overnight.
No.
It started with an idea,
Yeah.
and then it's been an amazing journey for you, I'm sure. Could you just take a few minutes for our audience and share,
Sure.
how you started with this idea to pastor and lead a church, and how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I was actually 16 when I felt called to ministry. I had people telling me, I think you're going to be a pastor someday. And I'm like, no, I'm going to be a doctor or a lawyer or something else. And then it just kept sort of gnawing at me that this may be what I was supposed to do with my life. But fast forward a number of years, I went to college and seminary, graduate school. And while I was there, I had this dream of wanting to start a church for people who don't go to church, thinking people who, for whatever reason, had said, I don't get it, doesn't make any sense, or I'm not interested, or I've had bad experiences in religion. And to start a church for those people and to be a place where you could be a critical thinker, where you're not asked to check your brain at the door of the church, and to understand intellectually the faith and then to experience it in the heart. And then finally to be called to live out your faith with your hands, to serve every day in your life. And when we started, there was just 4 of us. It was my wife and I and our 2 kids. I was 25 years old and Levon was 26, and we had a 2-week-old child and a 3-year-old child. And so it was, we started with a dream, and it just took off from there. And we found, the more people came, they've invited their friends, who invited their friends. And about 2/3 of our members are people who weren't actively involved in a church before. And they found, something there. Today, a lot of folks love the fact that we're engaged in serving the community. So I find a lot of people who aren't really sure about religion, but they see, hey, these guys are serving low-income people. They care about children in the inner city schools. They're, most recently we bought a dental mobile unit we had built for Swope Health System that will see 2,700 low-income children a year to clean their teeth, to take care of their cavities, all that. These are kids who would never have been to the dentist otherwise, except it shows up at their school and their parents gave permission. And Swope Health does a great job with it. But anyway, those are the kind of things that we just have fun doing. And then in the process of doing that, people go, I want to know more about this church. And all of us have spiritual needs. I mean, we all have needs for meaning, for love, for acceptance, for forgiveness, for grace, all of these things. And, as a Christian, I think Jesus offers us all that and shows us, God's puts flesh on God's love and grace and meaning for our lives. And so anyway, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a great adventure to start the church and see it take off. And,
Yeah.
35, we celebrate our 35th anniversary this October.
Oh,
And
that's awesome.
it's just been great.
One of the things that you just mentioned was critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that resonates with me because I think most people are considering critical thinking about their goals professionally,
Yeah.
but they don't consider critical thinking in regards to their spiritual journey. Would you maybe define, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So critical thinking, I take it to mean that we're willing to weigh things. We ask questions. God gave us a brain for a reason, expects us to use it. I love the fact that Jesus said that he quoting Moses, but we're to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And mind in the Greek New Testament, it's to weigh things. It's to ponder over things and weigh them. And so asking questions, thinking critically, and I feel like I want to see more of that especially with people of faith. Sometimes we say, well, we just accept things by faith. I've never been able to do that. I always loved the intellect. I loved, reasoning and critical thinking. And I remember early on as a Christian, I'd hear things people would say, and I'm like, that just doesn't make any sense. And I'd ask my pastor questions, and he'd say, don't ask so many questions, just accept it by faith. I'm like, I can't. I really need some answers. And that really came to a head and for a lot of people it does, when 2 of my dear friends were killed in an accident. And the answers that I would get from people, everything happens for a reason. It must have been the will of God. God needed them in heaven, or maybe they did something wrong and God was punishing them. And I'm like, that just doesn't make any sense. And so again, starting to ask, okay, are there better answers than that? Are there deeper answers? And United Methodists, and this is true of a lot of Christians, but we say we have the Bible and God speaks through Scripture, but it's a book that was also shaped by its historical and cultural context. And so we interpret Scripture with the powers of reasoning, so our critical thinking skills, as well as our life experience, as well as what others have said over the ages. And I find a lot of people really appreciate a faith that invites them to think. And we tell people doubt's not the opposite of faith; it's often a pathway towards faith. So asking questions is how you end up growing. And it's interesting, Jesus asked way more questions than he answered. So this is he's constantly asking people to think for themselves. He's asking them questions. I think it's like 200 questions Jesus asks in the Gospels. And
Can I ask you, because as you mentioned that, if I think back to our experience, there weren't a lot of answers.
Yep.
And I did have to do critical thinking because I was asking, like, God, where are you?
Yeah.
Where are you in this? And so when someone says to you that this tragic thing happened, they're looking for an answer. Like, how would God allow this? What would you say to them?
Well, I think there's several different answers to that. One is, we want to imagine that God is, a lot of times you'll hear people say, God is in control. God is in control of everything. It's like, well, in an ultimate sense, yes. But in this sense, we have a lot of control. So I decide if I'm going to drink and drive. I don't, but people decide they're going to do that. I decide whether I'm going to respond with kindness or with, cruelty. I make a lot of decisions. I have agency. God gave us agency. And so to think that I'm going to blame God for every bad thing that other human beings have done, or bad decisions that I make, or things that I've said, I can't blame God for that. We live in a world in which, this world is beautiful. It's amazing. But there's also inherent danger in this world. So there are tectonic plates that move. They move because the earth is cooling itself as the magma, rises to the surface, and then, it moves and the plates move on top of it. And that means there's going to be earthquakes sometimes. They're necessary for our life to support, or for our world to support life. I'm not going to say, well, God caused that earthquake to punish all those people somewhere. I'm going to go, no, we understand. The physicists help us understand, and the geophysicists help us understand how this works. So again, using your critical thinking to ask, so why did this happen? Somebody dies of cancer. I don't blame God for that. I want to fund research that helps us understand why cancer happens, and then what we can do to address it.
And often I think what we teach people is it's the meaning that you attach to the event.
Yep.
We're not in control of what happens. I mean,
Right.
looking back over a decade, what we went through, we would have never, coming out of the wake of that,
Yeah.
tragedy, who would have known we'd be sitting here today with you,
Yeah.
for example, talking about what we're talking about.
Right.
So we don't know. It obviously comes down to our faith and our trust in God that he's going to lead us towards something positive when we come
Right.
through these things.
Right. I often tell people, so within the Christian faith, there are Christians who think, well, God's going to protect you and nothing bad's going to happen to you if, unless God somehow has some purpose for it. And I'm like, wait a minute. Our religion is founded on a man who was tortured to death at the age of 33. So to think that our religion teaches that nothing bad is ever going to happen to you if you're a good person. No, we live in a world where things happen. But what you said is really important, Bob, and that is, so what will we do with that? Where do we find hope in the middle of that, or comfort or strength? Where do we find that? And then, what I believe is fundamentally true, I don't think God causes all these things to happen, but God has a way of redeeming them, of forcing something good to come from them. And that's the hope that I have. And so, the idea of Jesus' resurrection even is like, the suffering didn't have the final word. Death, cruelty, inhumanity didn't have the final word. And that's how it goes in our lives.
And that leads me right into your book on forgiveness. You said there are 3 questions implied in our existence. In the apology of the mother, this is an example you gave, which I love, that can kind of resonate with this. If you are the child who's been wounded, who perhaps experienced abuse when you were little, or whose mother did nothing to stop it, the question implied is, how do I keep bitterness, anger, hate, or the desire for revenge from consuming me? If you are the mother who feels great guilt because you didn't step in to stop the abuse, there perhaps are 2 questions implied. How can I be reconciled to the one I wronged? How can my burden of guilt be removed?
Yes.
And the obvious answer is there, but I wanted you to kind of take it from there.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And that's based on a story that somebody had actually written me about or had talked about.
Mhm.
So, I think, again, we're always going to be having to wrestle with how do we deal with forgiveness? So we have high school graduates right now, and I'm like, there's nothing you could learn more important in your high school career, in your college career, than the art of forgiveness. There's no thing that will be more important for your success in life than the art of forgiveness. And there's a whole lot to what forgiveness looks like and how it works. And, we have in the book, I talk about there are little pebbles, that are like little slights, and we just learn how to let go of those. And then there are bigger rocks. If you think about these, I use the metaphor of a backpack that I'm carrying with me, and I put those rocks and I hold on to them, the slights that people have harmed me with. There's a little bigger ones that are more serious, and there's some really huge rocks, and that's like the person who didn't stop the abuse. And
Yeah. And what we like to tell people, Adam, is that forgiveness is your cheat code to a life on purpose.
yes,
But
that's good.
when you're shepherding and working with like your flock, for
Yeah.
example, the people in your congregation, and they come in, do you hear things like, I'd like to forgive this or that or myself or whatever,
Yeah.
but I don't know how.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you hear
So absolutely. So there are people that want to forgive, and there are people who've kind of gotten used to the anger, bitterness,
They
and
kind of, in a way, they're getting something out of it, would we say?
that's exactly right. They've come to
Well,
love that.
I think there is a story around it, and it's been conditioned behavior
Yeah.
to say, I can't do that, or it's too hard, or you don't know my story. I can't.
Not part of my DNA. I wasn't raised that way.
Yeah, that's right. So I think about, at times, so part of that process of being able to forgive is trying to understand the person who has wronged. I was speaking to a man whose father was abusive, and as we were talking through that, it's I don't think there's very many people who grew up saying, I want to be a terrible dad who's going to abuse my children.
Mm-hmm.
So then you want to try to figure out what happened behind that, especially if the person is no longer alive.
Right.
And this happens, often. In the book, I talk about a man who was finally able to forgive after his dad had died, and then he'd go to the cemetery and he'd just sit there and have conversation. He'd take a bottle of wine and sit and have conversations with his dad, at the grave. But the ability to ask, I talk about one family who found out that their father, who was often angry and acted out of anger, they later found out that their father, when he was a boy, had been locked in the closet by his parents, and they would leave for periods of time, and he'd be there by himself in the darkness.
Right.
And so so you find hurt people. And all of a sudden, when they were able to understand what shaped him, it helped them to be able to, and the Greek word in the New Testament for forgive is to release or let go. It helped them to be able to let go. It didn't mean they excused the way that he treated them growing up, or said it was okay, or it didn't really matter. Of course it mattered. It hurt them. But to be able to let go of the right to retribution, or the right to continue to hate or be angry with their father because they came to understand he was a little boy who had been locked in a closet in the dark for hours. And then they could say, okay, I think I can finally let go.
I think that's been a really powerful question for myself, and I believe Bob, moving through our journey, is starting to ask a better question: is what am I missing here?
Yeah.
And when I ask that, I move from judgment to empathy.
Yes.
And it gives me a different perspective. And I want to go back to, I
He
think
does that a lot with me, by the way.
Of course, that's a key to making marriage work is being able to do that.
What else could this mean?
well, it's
I
feel like
do it.
we're more probably willing to do that with others outside of
That's so
ourselves.
true.
So
That is very true.
we get to practice on that. So I'm getting better at it. But I want to go back to, you had said, and I think it's amazing that you are working with youth around the concept of forgiveness, because everyone is like, it's a great idea, but I don't want to do it. And if they start practicing this and understand the power behind making the decision, because I think you had said God will redeem anything,
Yeah.
but we also have to reframe the experience so we are open to letting them redeem it in our lives.
Yeah.
Have you seen let's say, youth that you're working with open to this? Are you seeing a change?
Yeah. Well, and I don't get to spend very much time with our youth. I get to spend some time with them. We've got a great team of youth staff. But in the sermon this weekend, because it's graduation this weekend and next week, I really want to address them, and to be able to say, and your idea of reframing is really important. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, is how do you get a different perspective on what's happening that doesn't excuse the wrong that the person did, but helps me to be able to let go of the hurt or the pain that I have in response to that. And the idea that you will not have, you can't have a successful marriage unless you learn how to forgive. It's just almost a daily occurrence. Yeah, Lana and I've been married 43 years, and it's still a regular daily occurrence. So one of us snips at the other one, or we're short-tempered, or we're whatever.
Yeah.
And but for teenagers to know, this is a fundamental skill in life that I have to learn. Is how do I learn to be able to let go? How do I learn to be able to go and address the person who's wronged me? This is something Jesus teaches too. If your brother or sister has wronged you, go talk to them. Which often we don't talk to people. We just hold on to the little side. Then we don't know how to talk to them, so we attack them when we go to approach them when they've wronged us, and then that just puts up their defenses, and they're not really able to respond. So even the art, I'm guessing for the two of you, for Lavon and me, the art of knowing how to say to Lavon, "Hey, I love you so much. That little thing the other day, that really kind of ticked me off, but I do love you. You're beautiful, and I love you." But it's so to figure out how do you say things in a way, or she has to do that with me, where I can actually hear it, and then I can say, "I am so sorry. I didn't realize that I came across that way, and I thank you for telling me." But you got to learn how to approach each other in that day.
A lot of young that you're talking about, that may have not been modeled in their home.
That's exactly right.
In your book, you had said to live a successful life, and if you ever want to experience freedom and joy, you must use these 6 words regularly in your vocabulary. Will you
Yeah.
share what those are?
Sure. And I tell couples who are getting married, these 6 words, and they often think I'm going to say, I love you too. No, that's 7 words, I think. But the 6 words that no relationship can succeed without, no life can be successful without, is to regularly be able to say, I am sorry and I forgive you. And when we learn how to be able to say, I'm sorry, and then when we're regularly able to say, I forgive you, things happen. And this is a message that permeates the New Testament. So
Yeah.
the Lord's Prayer. I mean, so many people, not just Christians, but a lot of people have prayed that prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So we're asking for forgiveness, but we're also, Jesus doesn't just, he says we should forgive not just 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times. And I think it's amazing when you get to the cross in Luke's gospel, Jesus hangs there and he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. It's easy to say, oh yeah, that's Jesus. He can just say, well, not when he's being tortured to death, and he still prays,
Right.
Father, forgive them. And so there's it's just fundamental to life is we don't even mean to, but we're going to have slights. And sometimes people are going to do things that are much more serious than that. And I've been with families in our congregations whose loved ones have been murdered. Like you all had, obviously this defining story in your life, it ties into this, and so figuring out what do you do with that when it's your child who was murdered, or it's your good friend, or it's, and that's where I think your story is so powerful, as you work through that and help everybody else see, what did that look like for you, and what might that look like for me?
Yeah. Well, and going back to what you had just mentioned, Adam, one of the things that Kelly and I adopted and we're using now, and I do think it's been helpful, is saying, hey, that maybe that wasn't my best. Like, honey, that wasn't my best. Can we start over?
Yeah.
And then
That's working so much better with me than if I offended you, I'm sorry.
Oh,
You're like, well, let me tell you, you did. So,
exactly.
but I think
Yeah.
that's a great.
I just wanted to mention that because I think, as you met, it's really, it's not just the words we use, but it's the sincerity
Yeah.
behind the words, right? It's
Oh
like
my
what's
gosh.
really in our heart.
Oh yeah.
And I can just tell you my origin story. I grew up, in an Italian household.
Yeah.
And the words "I'm sorry" or "forgive me," this doesn't happen. It wasn't part of the DNA.
Yep.
So I think that was some conditioning Kelly mentioned early on. Like we all have conditioning through our environment, and that was a big piece for me that I had to learn how to reverse that behavior pattern. But I think, and again, we try to teach the patterns that are in our subconscious mind that are controlling our behavior that a lot of times we're not even aware of,
Yes.
but we're just programmed to respond or react in a certain way.
Yep.
And that can just take us off course.
I wanted just to ask if you'd be willing to share. I think when we were visiting, you had mentioned, as a pastor, you're growing this church.
Yeah.
And you had, I believe, a parishioner that maybe was, not working in your favor.
Yeah.
And, that's a big ask to be able to let that go. And I don't want to speak for you, but I believe I remember you saying that you just continued to love on him,
Yeah.
even though you knew what was happening.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Sure.
Because I think today in society, we are so easily offended.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's right.
Well, you mentioned revenge too. It's like how am I going to get even with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fundamental part. And in our world today, we're more polarized. We have a tendency with social media to be able to say things we wouldn't say to somebody's face. So it makes it even worse. This was before there was social media. So, but today, the things that I get this all the time. You all probably do too. But just yesterday, I got 2 letters from different people who were mad about something I had said or done. And it wasn't enough to say, I disagree with you, but there were cutting comments. There were like little things that were cutting. When I was 35, that bothered me a lot more. At 60, I'm like, well, God bless you, and I'm leaving the church. I'm like, God bless you. And I hope you're better. Your next church is better than this one. But at 35, I'd feel like I had to write a 4-page, letter to them.
Bonds.
Explaining why I was right and they were wrong. But in this situation, and it's not an uncommon occurrence, but this person was saying things and doing things that were really deeply hurtful, and to other people and to me, and and yet they would still show up and they'd sit in the second row of church on Sunday morning. So I'm getting ready to preach, and there's this person who has just hurt me, and done some things that were, I won't go into detail, and I found myself inside. I mean, I thought about it all the time, or it seemed like every day, but certainly on Sunday when I'd get up to preach and I'm seeing this person sitting there who's done these hurtful things, during the week. And I thought, okay, what would I tell someone else to do? And I thought about one of the things I thought was, there's 2 things we find in Scripture that are key in this. One is Jesus says to pray for those who wrong you. And I thought, okay, I'm going to pray for this person now. Some people might pray, Lord, strike them down with lightning. My prayer, but I don't think that's what Jesus had in mind. It was, Lord, I pray you would bless them. I don't know everything about who they are and why they are this way, but I pray your blessings upon them. And when I started praying, I had to pray through clenched jaw. Like I didn't really mean it, but I've learned if I say something long enough, it goes from my mouth to my heart. And so I would pray over and over. And I remember, so there's that. And then there's, the Scripture talks about, don't be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. So, and this comes from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament as well. So how do I return blessing for the hurt that I've received? Now, this isn't always a good thing to do. There are times where there's somebody who's abusive and you can't, you got to separate yourself from the situation. But in this case, I couldn't fire the parishioner. I couldn't say, would you please go to another church? So I had to figure out, how do I keep trying to bless them? What can I do despite how hurt I am to try to do something kind for them? And I remember one Sunday, after about 1.5 years of this, praying almost daily for this person. And that Sunday, somebody else was giving the pastoral prayer. This is the, prayer that our pastors share for the whole congregation in the middle of the service. And while the pastor was praying that, I was praying. And there was 2 things I've been praying. One is bless this person and help me to let go and help me to love this person. And on that morning, I remember it plain as day, when I prayed that, something shifted inside me. And I just let go of the anger and bitterness. And I just felt, as you mentioned a moment ago, empathy. And when I opened my eyes, I looked at this person and I loved them. And not like I wanted to be their best friend, just like I really care about that person. I have genuine empathy for that person. But it took 1.5 years.
And that's what I love
almost
about your
daily.
story.
Yeah.
People go, well, I tried it didn't work, but you get to practice that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it does take time. And
Yeah.
sometimes we never get to that point when the hurt is deep enough, but I do think that these ideas of praying for, continuing to return blessing instead of cursing somebody in response, those help us to be able to navigate and live with the pain that happens in life. And there's a whole lot of things that are just not worth carrying with you forever.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little things. You just got to go, life is too short for me to be mad about that all the time.
So can I take this one step further?
Yeah.
Looking back on that circumstance experience, what do you think the advantage was for you?
The advantage in
The experience.
the experience.
Because I do believe
Yeah,
most of these things in our life, they're lessons for us if we're paying attention.
absolutely. Everything's a lesson, right? I mean, every day, if you're paying attention, you're learning something. You're deepening your understanding of things. So for me, I would say that taught me. So I've shared that story 100 times in sermons and in pastoral ministry with people to say, this is my experience. This is what happened in my life. I think it could happen in your life. if you try these things too.
Hmm.
So you learn wisdom is knowledge that's gained by experience. And so if you're paying attention, you're gaining wisdom along the way and you're learning that actually worked that time. Maybe it'll work the next time. So
Yeah. Adam, we tell people often there's the unforgiveness is tied to a hidden commitment. What we mean by the hidden commitment is there's probably a story wrapped around that we don't want to look at. And it's probably tied to an emotion.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like that the unforgiveness is tied to an emotion that once they can maybe get the emotion out, talk about it, and release it, that the story goes with it?
Well, I think that's definitely true. I mean, that's a really good point and a key insight. I think sometimes so if I think of the hidden emotion, it's sometimes things we don't like about ourselves too. So it's ego, maybe.
Yeah.
And my feelings were hurt because you embarrassed me in front of other people. Embarrassing people in front of other people is one of those things that leads to a deep commitment to dislike or hate or whatever, because nobody likes to be embarrassed. It's like one of our fundamental things we don't want to be. And so when we are, so that's just one example of many other kind of hidden pieces. But when public embarrassment happens for a lot of people, that leads to, I'm not going to forgive you because you humiliated me in front of other people. And again, that requires a whole set of other things. But what are some of the other examples that you all talk about when it comes to the hidden emotions? I think that's a key insight.
Yeah, I think resentment's a big one. Jealousy.
Yeah.
Could be another one. But I think it all ties back to, I really do think the origin of a lot of that is we don't like things that we feel about ourselves or that we see in other people.
Oh, yeah.
We reflect it back. And I think it's an awareness thing to be able to come to terms with what I'm projecting out of this person I probably don't like about myself.
Yeah.
And why is that? But that's the key question.
Yeah.
I think one of them as well is like unworthiness.
Yeah.
I have seen that they're not expecting much more in their life. So, they're not teaching people how to treat them. And so they experience these over and over because they don't feel worthy.
Yeah.
There's obviously a lot of them, but one of the questions that we always get to, and I'd love to hear, is how would you explain your relationship with forgiveness?
Well, I think so. I just finished a 6-week series on the crucifixion and what does it mean. And underneath a lot of that, not all of it, it means a variety of things, but one of those is forgiveness. And when you can remember your own forgiveness, I think about, and I know all your audience isn't necessarily Christians, but from a Christian perspective, I think about Jesus on the cross, and part of what his death was saying. So I hear it as a message, and part of what it was saying is, I think God was saying, you've cut me 1,000 ways, every one of you. I mean, you've said things and done things that brought harm to God. And he says, and I want you to see the costliness of that, but also want you to know I've forgiven you. And so when I begin to know, I've got a long list. I can't even count them all the ways that I have messed up towards God, towards other people, in thought, word, and deed, by what I've done and by what I've left undone. And as a result of that, when I can comprehend the fact that I'm forgiven, that God chooses to forgive me, God can hold it against me, but God chooses to forgive me, then I think out of that, I have to ask, how can I then hold on to all this bitterness and resentment versus being able to let go? And it's a lifelong journey, but I find it's most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it's much easier to be able to forgive today and to be able to try to look with empathy at the person and something they've done, to recognize that they maybe didn't mean to do it, or even if they did mean to do it, they're humans and they're weak and they're fallible. And I just find the older I get, and I may be self-deceiving, I don't know, but I don't hold on to resentments very much anymore after a long period of learning just to let that go and trying to learn, I mess up all the time still. And so, to be able to ask forgiveness on a regular basis, to be able to say, I'm really sorry about that, and to eat crow. And I've learned to eat crow and like it, and I find it's really goes a long way when I can come to somebody and say, I understand you feel hurt by something I did, and I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I genuinely care about you, and I wish that I hadn't done that. Or I'm going to try to learn from this and be better the next time. And that's like freeing for you when you could actually ask for forgiveness. You just go, wow, I don't feel that burden myself either, that there's this alienation between that person. They have to decide what to do with it. But
But I don't think we also even consider, maybe someone's never even heard those words and what it does in their life as well. Even though forgiveness, I know, is for us,
Yeah.
but there's also a ripple effect. And I also look at, since we've been practicing this, talking about it, I see it in our own boys, just it's generational as what they're observing
Yep.
and what they're starting to practice as well.
Absolutely. That's what Romans 8:28, God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him. And it's like he doesn't cause the things to happen. He causes good to come from them. He redeems them. I think Martin Luther King Jr., when he was preaching at there was a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church in, I think it was Birmingham, Alabama. And it happened, a racist had planted dynamite underneath the steps on Sunday morning, detonated it during the Sunday school hour. The children were going to Sunday school and 4 children were killed. Dr. King was preaching the funeral of 3 of them. And he talked about how God has the capacity, and the imagery I had in my mind was taking a rod of steel, a bar of steel, and bending it for good. Right? He doesn't waste our suffering or our pain. And I think that's true when it comes to the harm that has happened and our ability to learn from it or grow from it.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what you're describing. Can I ask you two to do something for me? So your audience knows your story really well, but I'm going to be sharing this podcast on my podcast to be able to help our people know what, who you are and what you're doing. Would you just summarize your story and how all this began with forgiveness? And again, for your regular audience, I beg their forgiveness, but for my audience, I'm excited for them to hear a bit of your story.
Sure.
You want me to go? Okay. All right. Well, Adam, we woke up one morning to this horrific news that our best friends, my best friend for 25 years, had murdered his wife, which was Kelly's best friend since childhood, and one of their sons. And so that led us on this journey. About a year and a half after that happened, God really put it on our heart to try to take this. And again, the meaning that you attach to these things is so important. But the meaning that we had for over a year was just, this is just horrific. Let's sweep it under the rug. But God had a different plan.
Yeah.
And he put it on my heart to take this story and try to turn it into something good. Now, at that time, we had no idea what that meant. But I knew that it was like a lightning bolt when it came in. Kelly and I were on a plane, and I said, this is what we're supposed to do. God just spoke it to me. And so that led us on a journey of about 3.5 years to get this book called The Ravine done. And so it was our message of hope and forgiveness in the wake of this tragedy, this unthinkable thing. Like, how do we move this from a meaning that is so negative to something that could offer hope and light and forgiveness to the world? Then the movie followed that. And then, of course, the podcast.
Well, and
all this.
That's so powerful. So going back, I'm going to ask you now on your own podcast. I want to interview you. And so if you think about how you were able to, what were the mental reframing that you did to be able to look at what happened and the murder of your best friend and the children, and how were you able to reframe that so you could let go of the hurt, or, the hurt and the hurt stays, but the bitterness about that, the pain.
I think we're probably thinking the same thing,
That's
right?
probably the craziest part
Yeah.
of this whole story, is if I first consider how loving God is and how patient he is with us. I know Bob was getting so frustrated, like where we are today, that it's taken this long for our mission to really be growing. But I know that God was patiently waiting on me. I wasn't ready. I had not let go of the anger and the resentment and the guilt. And so I had to work on me before, and that was all necessary for us to be ready to be able to do this. But what's crazy about our story is, as Bob had mentioned early on, he was never observing someone with empathy. And that was really not his nature. So after the event, I obviously went in a very different direction and place than Bob did. I went to anger with everyone, even God. And Bob immediately went to, I got to find out what's missing, and had compassion.
Yeah.
And that's where it started. And I know that the calling came to and through Bob, because first he was open, and second, God knew he wouldn't quit on this mission.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't quit until I was ready.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. We went in very different directions in the beginning, but we ended up together.
It is interesting, and we were just talking about this again, Adam, that right after that happened, that's where my mind went to, is how did this guy that I knew, that I loved, and
Yeah.
the person I thought he was. How did he get to this point? And I felt bad because I totally missed it. How did I miss it?
Yeah.
And but as Kelly said, I didn't grow up that way. I really, my nature, my habit pattern really before that was to be very judgmental and maybe just cut people off. Like if
Yeah.
they offended me, okay, you're done. But with Danny, it was really it didn't work that way. And I know now why God placed that on my heart, because if I would have went there, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today, because we wouldn't have moved in a different direction. And eventually Kelly came along, and
What did you figure out about Danny over the, following that? How did you make sense of it?
that's a good question. It was very hard to do. Um, I don't know that we ever really made sense of it. I think that and the way we portrayed it in the story is that darkness can seep into our thought processes.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened. That's what I feel like happened to Danny, is that s- for whatever reason, he started going down a wrong path.
Yep.
And then they perhaps got into some financial trouble. I don't know if he thought this was the way out of it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if our audience, if you watch the film The Ravine or read the book, you'll see at the end, that's basically what we came to a conclusion, that we don't know why.
And you never know.
We'll never gonna know why. It's what are we going to do now going forward?
Right.
I remember along the journey of making the film, we had a conversation with the sheriff, and I remember him saying, be careful. Some of the questions you ask, there's never an answer.
Yeah.
And that was a moment on our, over a decade journey that we had to accept. There may not really be an answer here, but as we kept moving forward, the filming was necessary for me. I think it was when I actually let go, and it makes me emotional thinking about it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, um, but I came to the awareness that even though that he committed the unthinkable, that he should not be judged by that one act.
Mm-hmm.
That he really was a wonderful man in a lot of ways in his life and had impact in this world. That was a really big moment for me.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's so difficult about forgiveness, Adam, is the why. Like, why do these things happen?
Yeah.
And how do I reconcile it in my own mind? How do we offer forgiveness in these situations?
Yeah.
And then how do we move forward?
Right. You mentioned something earlier, Kelly, about being angry even with God at that period of time. And I think that's a natural response when terrible things happen, because we think God should have stopped it from happening, or maybe in the extreme, some people think God made it happen. Most of us understand God doesn't make terrible things like this happen. But being able to wrestle with what happens in life sometimes, so we can understand earthquakes geophysically, human beings, what human beings do sometimes, and how you can see that and still see their humanity, which is what you described as you looked at Danny and you came to see something terrible had happened in his mind and his thought processes. We can call it some kind of mental illness or some kind of spiritual battle, or we can talk about, the all of the forces that were coming, the financial and all those kind of things. And often people in the midst of crisis make terrible flash decisions. This is often suicide as well. As there is this moment where you think there's no hope and there's no way out, and this is the only thing I can see. And the ability for people to come to the place where you can say, that person must have been suffering an awful lot for them to have decided to do something so horrible, which leads you to a certain empathy.
Right.
It doesn't forgive the thing that happened, but it leads you to an ability to see their whole story and not just the worst thing that they did, but all of these other pieces. And then that leads you to the ability to let go of the anger and hate, to be able to look at somebody with a new frame, which is what you two have demonstrated so well, and then what you're trying to help other people do, which I really love. I think, again, and so it was Paul Tillich, the great philosopher and theologian of the 20th century, who said, forgiveness is the divine answer to the questions implied in our existence. So we are going to hurt each other. We are going to be hurt. We are going to have things happen that leave our hearts broken sometimes. And forgiveness was God's answer, which God modeled for us on the cross, but God, Jesus calls us to. But forgiveness the capacity to go through a process of being able and to work through over time a process of being able to reframe things, to be able to assume the best of people, to be able to recognize our own shortcomings, and see our own humanity, and then the ability to finally release or let go of that big bag of rocks that we've been carrying around with us and find ourselves free.
I got to just say something because you had said, I got to go back to you were angry with God. And I honestly, I think I have the awareness now. It wasn't even the why. It was the scripture, I will not ever forsake you.
Yeah, leaving you or forsaking you. Yeah.
And I'm like, really? I challenged him, like, where are you?
Yeah.
Because I don't see you in this at all.
Yeah.
But looking back,
Yep.
he was everywhere in it.
Yeah.
And I think when I reframed it and went to a state of gratitude, because I could see his hands all the way through bringing good out of it, that's when everything changed for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's beautiful. And I do think because there are a host of scriptures where if you read it a certain way, the idea is that God's going to protect you from all harm, nothing, the angels, all of these kind of beautiful things. And yet our life experience doesn't always line up with that. And so part of what we recognize is God walks with us through whatever. Sometimes God's hard to see or hear, but God walks with us through it. But God isn't manipulating or causing, either stopping the terrible things from happening. He's there for us to cling to in the middle of those things. And I think about that with a lot of these, especially parents who've lost children, and that, God didn't want this, God didn't cause this, and God also doesn't prevent it. I wish God did. I just wish that it worked this way. If I could just say a prayer, your cancer would go away, your children would never do terrible things. It doesn't seem to work that way. What I do know is that in the middle of our darkest moments, we cling to him and we find somehow comfort or strength or help, that we're not alone, and that the darkness or the pain or the hurt doesn't have the final word. And then God uses us to do something about it. Every time I preach on a funeral for somebody who's died prematurely, a young man, a father or a young woman, or the suicides or whatever, it's like God forces good to come from suffering. He didn't cause this to happen so that good would happen, but God forces good to happen out of this. But the way God does that is through you. It's through the people sitting in that funeral. What will we do now in response to that? And that's what you've been doing for 10 years, is you've been saying, what can we do to be used by God to force something good or redemptive to come from this? And so again, I just want to say, well done. I think what you're aiming at is so important, and I want to encourage you in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate that. All right. Well, Adam, it was such a pleasure and an honor to have you here today. What a blessing just to be able to speak with you about these topics. And
thank you. Well, the honor was mine, Kelly and Bob. I really appreciate both of you. Thanks for inviting me to be here.
Thanks for tuning in to Making Sense of Faith with Adam Hamilton. Do you know someone wrestling with life's biggest questions? Share this episode with them, because the more people willing to embrace the hard questions, the better. Do you want to go deeper? You can visit makingsenseoffaith.com to find the show notes and additional resources. That's also where you can sign up to get the notes and resources delivered straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this episode, hit subscribe and leave us a rating in your podcast player. That'll make sure that you get the latest episodes and help others find the podcast. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit that notification bell to catch future episodes and videos there. Until next time, remember that your questions matter. Doubts are normal, and making sense of faith is a lifelong journey. We'll see you on the next episode of Making Sense of Faith.